Hello and a very warm welcome to Quadriga. In just a matter of hours, Donald Trump will be inaugurated as 45th President of the United States. Here in Europe, many are worried that the transatlantic partnership stands before unprecedented challenges. Trump has called NATO obsolete. He's convinced that the EU will fall apart after Brexit. He's demanding punitive duties on imported German cars, and he calls Angela Merkel's refugee policy catastrophic. So is Trump a potential nightmare for Europe? That's what we want to talk about here on Quadriga today, and we've invited three guests who follow transatlantic relations closely. It's a pleasure to welcome Ulrike Herrmann. She's a business editor for the Berlin daily, the Taz, and she believes Trump might be an opportunity for Europe by forcing the EU to unite. And it's great to have Erik Kirschbaum back on the show. He's the Germany correspondent for the Los Angeles Times and formerly worked with Reuters. He thinks Trump is a loose cannon, but he will soon learn the limits of his powers thanks to all the checks and balances in place with Congress and the Supreme Court. And it's great to welcome Tom Goeller. He's a freelance journalist focusing on U.S. and security affairs. In his opinion, in the eyes of many Americans, Germany and other European countries behave like scroungers when it comes to NATO membership. It's time for Chancellor Merkel to confront longtime pampered Germany with reality. So, Donald Trump gave his first big interview to a major German newspaper this week, and he also spoke to the Times of London. And in it, he pretty much questioned every orthodoxy on which the transatlantic relationship is based, from free trade to the European Union as a source of stability and peace, from the alliance with Germany to the future of NATO. So I'd like to first of all start out by asking all of you to just give me a sense of your reaction. And starting with you, Erik, you say Donald Trump is a loose cannon. So would you see the kind of statements he made in this interview or his tweets as a real guideline to what he's likely to do once he's in office?
If you listen to his words and take him at face value, it can be pretty scary. He hasn't been acting very presidential at all, and there was a hope he would become more presidential and more graceful and reach out to the other side, but he hasn't. Maybe that'll change when he takes office. But if you look at the interview in Bild, one thing I thought was optimistic is that he said NATO is very, very important. Everybody jumped on the first half of the sentence when he said NATO is obsolete, but he's been saying that for a long time. But he also said NATO is very, very important. For me, that was new, and that was a signal. You know, read everything he says. Don't just take. He says a lot of things, and if you grab those things he says and you're too pessimistic about it, if you see the glass as half empty, you're going to be disappointed. I see the glass as half full. He's got 100 days to maybe change and maybe act a little more presidential, and let's see what happens.
Ulrike Herrmann, what was your reaction? What's your reaction altogether as we approach this really historic inauguration?
Well, what I really found shocking about this interview was that it had so many factual mistakes. It was very obvious that Trump really doesn't know what he talks about. And that, I think, is a problem for a president, especially...
That's not new. We knew that.
Yeah, that's true. But, you know, the other presidents always gave this impression that they want to learn. But, you know, Trump is just the opposite. He claims to know everything. He claims to know how to change the world. He claims to be the most wonderful businessman there ever was. But at the same time, he doesn't know anything. But he doesn't give the impression that he wants to learn. And that is really dangerous.
Tom Goeller, as I mentioned, many Europeans who read this interview were alarmed. Were you alarmed?
Not necessarily, because he just repeated what he actually had said prior in his election campaign, that NATO is obsolete is not the first time that he said that. What I found interesting is that it was the first significant interview he has given, and that was for European to European newspapers. So actually, I read out of that he cares for Europe, that Europe is important to him, because otherwise he would not have to give this interview and say, look, Europeans, I have to tell you something. And what he had to tell us, he did.
Many people in Europe felt that actually his attitude toward Europe sounded pretty indifferent. You might refer to his remarks on both Germany and the EU as damning with faint praise. Let's listen to what he had to say on that point.
If you look at the UK, if you look at the European Union, it's Germany. It's basically a vehicle for Germany. That's why I thought the UK was so smart in getting out. I believe others will leave.
So, Erik Kirschbaum, would you expect him, on the basis of what he said there and what he said elsewhere about the EU, to take a sort of a divide and conquer approach? And if so, will that really make the US great again?
He's a businessman, and he's always thinking of ways to divide and conquer to get a good position. But what he said, there's some truth to that. There's a kernel of truth to what he's saying, that the EU, Germany does profit enormously from the EU. Germany benefits from the EU. The euro is something that really helps Germany in its exports. I mean, Germany is one of the world's leading export countries. So he's saying something that's provocative, and it's not something you usually hear from a president, but there's some truth to what he's saying.
Ulrike Herrmann, you say this could prompt European countries to pull together. Really?
Yes, well, I think that's, again, an instance where Trump just misrepresented reality, because, in fact, Great Britain profited from the EU even more than the Germans. But it's true that the British didn't realize that. But so the result of the Brexit will be that they really lose out economically, which will result in all other countries not to leave the EU. I mean, the whole... Again, this whole quote shows that Trump really doesn't know anything about Europe.
And do you think the U.S. would be better off with a divided Europe, economically speaking?
No, of course not, because the United States profit a lot from their trade with Europe. But one thing is true about the US that's somehow disturbing for the Europeans. If there is a country that doesn't really take part in globalization, it's the US, because it's such a big country that foreign trade doesn't really matter a lot. I mean, that's another misrepresentation of Trump. He always tries to tell the Americans that everything would be better if there wasn't any trade. But the fact is that trade is hardly important for the US anyway. It's just about 11% of the GDP. But I think in the long run that Trump will not change anything in these trade relations, because very many companies in the US, of course, rely on exporting to Europe.
I want to come back to trade a bit later in the show, but Tom Goeller, tell me this. Doesn't the kind of talk that we heard there, that we saw in that quote, EU bashing and frankly also some Germany bashing in that interview, doesn't that simply feed resentments of right-wing political groups here all across Europe? They are very much EU skeptical, if not absolutely opposed to the EU. We've got a really important election year here in Europe in a number of different European countries. Don't you think this feeds into nationalist right-wing populism?
It feeds a couple of things. Certainly, yes, the right-wingers here, for example, the AfD in Germany or in Netherlands, or Le Pen movement in France, yes, they feel backed by that kind of remarks from Donald Trump, without saying that he is the same caliber as they hear. I mean, we can't compare both movements, so to speak. But it also feeds anti-Americanism, which is actually more from the left in Europe, in this sense that the Americans kind of, show now their real face, that Donald Trump is just a voice. He voices a vast majority in the United States, which exists for a long time, which is not new, that they envy the success of the European Union. They envy the success of the euro. They are not happy, actually, with the euro, because Americans in general want their America first, is the dollar first, right, and not another similar, not a similar money like the dollar. So he feeds a couple of attitudes or ideas or opinions, and I think he is not always aware of that.
Ulrike Herrmann, Tom Goeller just implied that Donald Trump, at any rate, is more moderate than European right-wing populists. Can we be so sure of that?
I wouldn't be too sure, because, in fact, what Trump does is to feed racism in in the United States. The racism will increase, and that's what all black people or Hispanics report, that they feel insecure in the United States.
Actually, racism increased under Obama, so why do you expect racism increases even more?
Because I would not accept your statement that racism increased.
It did, it's a fact.
No, it is not.
You might not like it, but it's a fact.
But anyway, now you have a president who endorses racism. That is a fundamental change.
Okay, I want to cut that conversation right there. I'm sorry, but I want to try to move us on to two particular areas that people are quite concerned about here in Europe, not only on the basis of the interview published this week, but also on the basis of other statements that Donald Trump has made, namely security on the one hand, trade on the other. So let's start out with the question of security, which boils down to one issue above all. Could a Trump presidency undermine the very foundations of the post-war order, namely the transatlantic alliance, NATO, on the one hand, and the principle of territorial sovereignty on the other, namely also due to the Russian incursions into Ukraine? So let us talk a little bit about that and start out by seeing this report about the people that Trump has nominated to some of the key positions involving security.
Trump admires Russian President Vladimir Putin and sees him as a possible trading partner. But there have been harsh words for Moscow from Trump's team, especially following allegations of Russian hacking during the U.S. election.
This was an aggressive action taken by the senior leadership inside of Russia.
Russia today poses a danger.
Trump has characterized NATO as obsolete. He says the alliance has problems and that it has not done enough to fight terrorism. His designated Secretary of Defense has said,
NATO, from my perspective, having served once as a NATO Supreme Allied Commander, is the most successful military alliance probably in modern world history, maybe ever.
So whose perspective will win out, Trump's or that of his political appointees?
Erik, what do you say to that question? Who's likely to win out if it comes to relations with Russia? We have, on the one hand, somewhat moderate statements, somewhat Russia-skeptical statements by the future Secretary of Defense, if in fact he is confirmed, and also on the part of the future Secretary of State. On the other hand, we have some very warm statements from Trump in regard to Russia.
It is confusing. I mean, it's typical Trump. The last 3 months in the transition has been also filled with these contradictory statements. But encouraging is the Senate hearings that have shown that the nominees have different opinions than Trump. And I was encouraged by that, and I think it's a good sign. And Trump has said he's open for discussions. It'll be a new way of maybe public discussions about these things. For most Americans, though, it is alarming to see the way Trump has been so positive about Putin. And I'm sure for a lot of Republicans in Congress, it's been very alarming to hear Trump talking so favorably about Russia. And that's something that's going to lead to tension, I think, in the Congress. As you know, congressmen in the United States are much more independent than they are in Germany. And I think Trump is going to be running into all kinds of problems with Republican congressmen unhappy about the friendship that he's developing towards Putin.
Indeed, the Congress has decided to hold hearings on the Russian hacking issue. That perhaps could also turn up things that might be uncomfortable for Donald Trump. Ulrike Herrmann, people in Washington who are observers of the political process say they expect Donald Trump to lead essentially like a CEO of a big corporation who sets kind of the broad lines of strategy but leaves the details to his ministers. On the other hand, his designated cabinet appointees are also competing centers of power. We have some who are quite pro-Russian, others who aren't. How do you expect that to play out?
I think the most important problem will be that no one on this cabinet has any experience with governing. They are all billionaires coming from outside. And I think it will be very curious to see how they all try to govern a superpower without having any political experience. And all of them think that they are stars. They all think that they are billionaires because of their own intelligence, not because they just happen to be lucky. So this is going to be a very interesting family grouping in a way. You know, you can really see them fighting like children over power, influence, and fame in a way. So.
Tom Goeller, at the very least, aren't divisions amongst the various cabinet appointees, and perhaps with Trump as well, likely to encourage divisions in Europe? We know that we have some Eastern European countries terribly worried about potentially being the next victims of Russian expansion. And on the other hand, we have other Eastern European countries that would very much like to do a deal with Russia. Yes. So what would you expect all of this to set in motion here in Europe?
Actually, I think the Germans in particular should be grateful that Donald Trump is going to end this terrible tension that the Obama administration has built up with Putin. I mean, that Obama had the guts even to send in 4,000 American troops in his very last days to Poland shows that he never was able to cope with Putin. So we should be grateful that there is one who at least says, I want a new approach. This is a sign of hope, and especially for the German left and liberal sides, who always favored we should play down the tension with Putin. I think here is someone who really can stir the course around to the better.
Would that be playing down the tension, or would that be appeasement?
It sounds like appeasement to me. I mean, the NATO countries in Eastern Europe want the support. They've been begging for support from the United States and other NATO partners, and it's a small token show of solidarity to send 4,000 troops.
Do you think we'll see them pulled out again by Trump?
Could be. I mean, he's not in power yet. We'll have to see what happens. His defense minister's not in office yet. It's still early days. Well, we'll see.
Let us briefly hear from the Chancellor, because she appears to have gotten the Trump message that NATO and Europe need to do a great deal more if they want to keep the transatlantic alliance healthy. Let's hear what she had to say this week.
Let's not fool ourselves. From the point of view of our traditional partner, I'm thinking here of transatlantic relations, there is no lifetime guarantee for close cooperation with us Europeans. We must continually work for it as Europeans. That's why I'm convinced that Europe and the European Union will have to learn to take on more responsibility in the world in the future.
Ulrike Herrmann, your opening statement professed the hope that we might actually see Europeans pull together a great deal more, take a lot more initiative. Do you see real signs of that? Those are some fine words from the Chancellor. Do you think we'll see actions follow?
Well, I think, of course, right now everyone just waits what will happen, because so far Trump has not been president, and so far he's been saying a lot of contradictory things, so no one really knows what he's up to. But I think that even now the Europeans start to prepare themselves for being more united, because one thing is very obvious, just as Mr. Kirschbaum said, it's this try by Putin to conquer and divide, or divide and conquer, that the Europeans, of course, must oppose. And they always, they didn't have to do that in the past, but now they will have to discuss a lot among themselves before addressing the US. Up to now, they just addressed the US. Everyone had his own foreign minister traveling to Washington and to just talk to the administration, because there was no harm done. That, of course, will be gone. Now, before anyone travels to Washington, he will be briefed by all the other European countries what he is supposed to say. So the style of politics will change, and perhaps even the substance.
Now, Donald Trump's approach, not only on NATO, is clearly a transactional approach. As you said, he likes to do deals, and he expects that NATO is essentially a deal, and the others need to ante up if they want to get American protection. The same approach appears to be guiding him in the area of trade, and I'd like to move on to that now just briefly, because we don't have a lot of time left. He said in that interview on Monday that you'll find a Mercedes in front of practically every luxury home in the U.S., but you don't find a Chevrolet in front of such homes in Germany. And he threatened punitive duties of 35% on imported cars in Europe. So, Ulrike Herrmann, I happened to be in a German region with a lot of auto suppliers on Monday as that interview came out. They were deeply alarmed about this. Do we have a trade war coming up?
This interview again shows that Trump doesn't know what he talks about, because the Chevrolet isn't in Europe, and especially not in Germany, because GM owns Opel. Now, of course, what GM doesn't want is that Chevrolets in Germany compete with Opel from the same company. So Chevrolets are not being sold how do you say that? Well, you try to just minimize the Chevrolets driving around Germany. So again, Trump is talking about something that's completely untrue. Now, if he wanted to have tariffs of 35%, he would, of course, hurt American companies as well, because it's you can't imagine him having 35% of a tariff and Europe not reacting. So in the end, you would have a trade war and no one would be gaining.
He's had some success with this rhetoric so far, though, with the Carrier air conditioners in Indiana and with the Ford plants in Mexico. And he's trying to use it against Europe as well, but he's really going to be shooting himself in the foot because, once again, this shows his powers are limited. He doesn't have the power to introduce a 35% tariff.
Especially,
he can only do it for short term. The Congress will have to go along with this. And it's hard to imagine a Republican Congress that's going to go along with a protectionist president. The United States lives from open borders and free trade. There'll be some adjustments to the North American Free Trade Pact, but it's not going to be the end of open trade for the United States with a Republican Congress.
Tom Goeller, are you quite sure of that? The very people who supported Trump, of course, are those most hurt by globalization. Many of them the same groups that support right-wing parties in Europe. Many people are saying the era of globalization as we knew it is dead.
Yes, I agree. The area is dead. But let me come back to this remark of Donald Trump. I agree, he can't do what he wants to do. It's impossible. He's not Mr. Almighty. But he obviously delivers to those who elected him, voted for him. The workers, the ordinary people who want to hear end of globalization, jobs that are created for us. That is his threats, which, by the way, worked already in a couple of examples. For example, Ford stays in the US and does not expand to Mexico and so forth. I think it's more a message to the domestic. It's more a domestic message than a world message. And if Germans feel afraid, I'm really... it sounds a bit laughable, because the Germans are the expert champions in the world. And if they are not able to bypass things like that...
35% duties, that's a pretty steep duty.
Well, as I said, Donald Trump can't make what he wants. That won't happen the way he wants. It's more a message for at home than abroad. However, the Germans will be able to fix that. I'm absolutely sure.
Ulrike Herrmann, both gentlemen have said that Trump's words, for example, to the automaker Ford in the U.S. or to the air conditioner manufacturer Carrier, actually produced action in the sense that jobs stayed in the U.S. Critics in the U.S. say, nonsense. Ford didn't go to Mexico because the gas price is too low. It wasn't worth building those cars. Has what he has done so far really made any difference in terms of jobs?
Whatever influence Trump had, one thing you really have to see is 5,000 jobs in the United States is just nothing. What people keep forgetting is it's an economy with 320 million people. And every day, 40,000 people lose their jobs, change their jobs, and so on. So 5,000 jobs is just nothing.
Symbolic.
And, and the problem is in the United States that the media do not report that. Instead, everyone does a huge cover story about Ford building a factory in the United States or not moving its factory because of 5,000 jobs. And I think that is really just plain crazy.
Well, is that quite true, Erik Kirschbaum? Reuters certainly did report the skepticism on the Ford pressure, essentially pressure that was accomplished with telephone calls and tweets, Trump using that bully pulpit. But would you truly say the media do not report the other side of Trump's...
I think it's out there, but it's not. It's a question of will people be able to find it in the flood of information swirling around. I mean, I've read it as well, so I know I've read it in the media.
But the coverage is for 5,000 jobs thanks to Trump.
Yeah, I mean, that's the simplified version. Trump has been an expert of the simplified version, but the whole message, too. BMW exports cars from the United States around the world, so Trump doesn't really even know what's going on in the United States. BMW is a big manufacturer in the United States.
Back to Europe, because we have just one moment left in the show, and I'd like to get all of you to answer our title question briefly, if you would, please. The media take in Europe is Trump could be a nightmare for Germany and Europe. What do you all say? Yes or no? Nightmare?
Yes, he can be a nightmare because he doesn't know anything about facts.
He won't be a nightmare. He will help Europe to eventually find itself and create a greater Europe.
He could be a nightmare, but give him 100 days and wait to see if he becomes more of a president and less of a candidate.
Thank you very much to all of you for being with us today, and thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. See you soon.